afternoon and welcome on behalf of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council to this edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report. I'm Dr. Richard Downey, and I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and we're delighted to have you all here with us tonight. And by the way, we're also delighted to have Dan Schnur back from the beautiful island of Tobago, where he was during the last time we had one of these things. So we're happy to have Dan back with us and talking about tonight a very special topic, which is who's winning the fight over America's borders. Now, this is a topic that is really the intersection between immigration and trade and national security. And many of you that are watching tonight are watching from outside California. But for those of us here in Los Angeles, this is a topic that is really close to home. We see ICE raids frequently. Many of you may not realize, the National Guard troops that were deployed to Los Angeles, there's still 300 here deployed in Los Angeles. And that's, of course, a point of contention with our mayor and our governor. And so I know many of you, all of us, myself included, are looking forward to Dan's insights on this issue. I do want to mention, I know that many of you were having problems registering for this event because you had trouble logging into the member portal. And what we're doing, we're transitioning from the Salesforce platform to our current platform, which is cheaper and easier to manage, but there's always glitches. If you have had a problem, please go to Krista's sites. There's an issue there in the chat box. And if you'll send her your information, she will send you a link. And in the future, if you have a problem registering for any of our events, she'll get you started back onto that. I do want to mention also, we have some very exciting events coming up this month. We have the exclusive Shell refinery tour. We have the foreign minister of South Africa coming, but I want to call special attention to the gala, the World Prize Gala that we have on the 30th of September. We're honoring three great people, former Representative Jane Harman. It's the Bob Abernathy, who is one of our longtime board members and who is chair of the Los Angeles Music Center, as well as Dominic Ng, who is the chairman and CEO of East West Bank. And we'll also have a Youth Prize Award, but we'll have Larry Wilmore, who's a comedian you may remember from The Daily Show. It's going to be a fun event. It's on the 30th of September. Please, also, there's a link in the chat box if you're interested, or you can go to our website. We want you to be part of the conversation today. You can do that very easily by just going down anytime throughout this session. Just go to the bottom of your screen, go to the Q&A button there, and you can type in your question at any time. And today, for the very first time, our new communications manager, Brianna Rue, will be the host, and she'll be not only asking questions of Dan, but she'll be asking your questions to Dan. So we look forward to that. So anytime, please feel free to ask your questions. And remember, there's a members only session after this. So if you didn't get your question answered during this part of the session, this hour, if you're a member, you can go to that next session and Dan will answer your question. So if you're not a member, please become one. It really helps us a lot, and we would very much appreciate it. Easy to do. Please just go to our website, go to the members, and you can become a member very easily. Finally, I want to thank all of you who have donated in the past. We really appreciate it. It's a lifeline for us. And so for those of you who have not had the opportunity to donate yet, or would like to do so again, and you're in a position to do so, if you go to in the chat box, there's a link to donate, but you can also anytime go to our website. Up in the very top right corner of our website, on every page, by the way, there's an orange button that says donate. It's easy to do, and we really appreciate it. As I say, helps the council out tremendously. It's a lifeline for us, so thank you. But now it's time for us to get to find out who's winning the fight over America's borders. So Dan, I'm looking forward to this, as is everybody. Thank you.
Richard, thank you very much. As always, we really appreciate everything you do, not just on this program, but everything. for the World Affairs Council.
Thanks, Dan.
And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this discussion. As Richard said, we will talk in just a little bit about immigration. That was the topic I think we'd originally decided we would focus on this week. But Richard also mentioned in passing another topic that has really moved to the front of the headlines. And Brianna and Krista and I talked about it over the last several days, and realized that while the issues surrounding and the debates surrounding our country's borders is a critically important one, it's an ongoing one. And we feel that a related issue that Richard mentioned, which has been the president's deployment of National Guard troops in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and potentially other cities around the country, is part and parcel of this same broader effort on Trump's part to rally his base politically, but also to move very aggressively on a law and order, public safety oriented agenda. And so we do want to talk for the first portion of today's program about these National Guard questions. And at that point, we'll move on, we'll segue into a discussion about immigration policy and in practice. So I know it seems like a long time ago, but it was just 3 months ago, barely 90 days, that Trump federalized roughly 4,000 National Guard members and 700 Marines into Los Angeles when there were protests here in LA surrounding the Trump immigration enforcement agenda. And at that time, California's Governor Gavin Newsom, not surprisingly, vehemently opposed Trump's action. He sued Trump and the federal government for violating the Posse Comitatus Act and the 10th Amendment. The Posse Comitatus Act, of course, which prohibits the use of U.S. military in domestic law enforcement situations. So the judge, the Northern California federal judge, originally ordered the states to be returned to state control, but then he delayed enforcement until early September in order to have appeals heard. Now, before that appeal process had been run out, a higher federal court paused that ruling, and they essentially ruled that the troops could continue in Los Angeles in support roles while the case proceeds. And it's only been in the last few days that Judge Breyer up in the Bay Area has ruled again, more emphatically this time, that National Guard troops can only be deployed to protect federal property and not in terms of more proactive law enforcement actions of the type in which they were involved here in LA. Now, those protests and that surrounding controversy, although there are, as Richard still mentioned, still a few hundred Guard troops on the streets here in LA, for the most part, the bulk of that controversy has passed as we move from summer into fall. But I think Trump realized that as unpopular as his action was here in deep blue California, and as angered as Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass and other state and local leaders were, I think Trump realized that Trump decided he saw some benefit in the action. So just a few weeks ago, the second week of August, Trump declared a crime emergency in the District of Columbia. And as you, of course, all know, because the district is not a state and is governed by what's called the D.C. Home Rule Act, under which the federal government shares responsibility with the D.C. local government for overseeing the district and its affairs. So what Trump did by declaring a crime emergency is he essentially transferred control of the District of Columbia Police Department from the city of DC, of the city of Washington, D.C. He transferred control of their police department to the federal government, and then in addition deployed about 2,000 National Guard troops. So those troops, have been deployed in DC for about 3 weeks now. And on one hand, there's no question, and the mayor of the District of Columbia, Muriel Bowser, has talked about this, crime is down in the district, and by a noticeable margin. there's an ongoing debate about how effectively the Guard troops are being used. Some are acting in support of police for arrests and apprehensions. Um, other guardspersons are being used for trash pickup and graffiti cleanup and for grounds maintenance, which is not really a military use. And there's been a huge debate within the district about whether this should continue or not. Just yesterday, Mayor Bowser said that she would continue to cooperate with the federal government to keep the National Guard deployed in Washington. But just today, Washington, D.C.'s Attorney General, and like in a state, the Attorney General of the District of Columbia is an elected position. D.C.'s Attorney General, just a day after the mayor had said that she'd continue to work with the National Guard, the District of Columbia's Attorney General filed a lawsuit arguing that the D.C. Guard deployment violated the Home Rule Act. So it's a huge controversy, not just in the District of Columbia, but around the country. Because, of course, Trump, as I think most of you have read, has also threatened to deploy Guard units to many other large cities: Chicago, Baltimore, New York, Oakland, and San Francisco, arguing that the high levels of crime justify the move. The state and local leaders in those regions argue that crime is down in most of these municipalities. And Trump was also criticized for only mentioning cities in Democratic states. Have you heard the ones I mentioned? Chicago, Illinois, Baltimore, Maryland, New York, Oakland, and San Francisco, California, all are states with Democratic governors. So just yesterday, Trump began talking about New Orleans, Louisiana. And while New Orleans, of course, like most big cities in the country, is a heavily Democratic city, the state of Louisiana is deep red Republican. And already the governor of Louisiana, Governor Landry, has already talked about how much he'd welcome Trump deploying Guard troops. Now, don't get me wrong. And as you know, I work very hard not to take sides in most of the issues that we discuss and that we debate here. Don't get me wrong. I believe that Trump believes that there is too much crime in these cities and that having the Guard presence does help in that regard. But I believe that Trump also understands that by moving so aggressively on an issue like this one, he's putting leading Democrats, not just the mayors of these cities, but the entire Democratic leadership apparatus in a very uncomfortable position. Because on one hand, if they agree with Trump, it looks like they're complicit in working with him. And you have a Democratic Party that is very much looking for opportunities to push back on Trump. But what a lot of leading Democrats understand is if they push back too hard against Trump on this, and I think this is what Mayor Bowser was attempting to avoid in Washington, D.C., they realize if they push back too hard, it comes across like they're accepting of the current levels of crime in these cities. And even while crime is down in recent years, if you live in a large urban area, this is something that concerns you. So the Democrats are walking a very fine line on this. This is an issue that's really dividing their party. And Trump is not only benefiting from it, but it appears to be greatly enjoying it. So all that said, we want to somewhat belatedly bring you into the conversation. So this is a hugely controversial issue. Krista, if we can put up the first poll question. This is a question not about Trump per se, although he's the one who's been acting, but more generally, do you support or oppose the use of National Guard of the National Guard to reduce crime in U.S. cities? One, the first answer is that yes, I do support it. Crime is out of control, and we need to do something to bring crime back under control to more manageable levels. Second, yes, I do support the use of National Guard, but only when the president is working with state and local officials. And that's been the case historically in the past. When there's been a national emergency, a natural disaster, widespread unrest, presidents and governors, even of different parties, have cooperated on this. And obviously, this is a very different set of circumstances. Third, no, I oppose the use of Guard troops on city streets. Crime is too high, but there's other ways to reduce crime. And then fourth, finally, no, I do oppose the use of the guard troops on the streets of US cities because crime rates are already coming down. We just need to keep doing what we're doing. So, Krista, how do we do? What did our group have to say about this one? Hmm. Well, that's a pretty interesting split. Only 9% of our group, that's not all that surprising given our makeup, uh, is wholeheartedly in support of Trump on this one, saying, yes, we need to send in troops to crack down on crime. 24%, almost a quarter of our group, agrees that it's the right thing to do, but only if the president is working cooperatively with state and local officials. 28%, a little bit higher, said, no, I oppose it. But there's other ways to reduce crime. We should explore those. And we can talk more about that a little bit later in the second half an hour, if all of you like. And then a somewhat higher number, 38%, say, no, we don't need to deploy troops. Crime rates are already coming down. Things are heading in the right direction. We're doing all right. But if you add these numbers up, roughly more, almost 2/3, 66% of our group, if I'm adding right, say that they are against the guard deployment, and only 33%, 1/3, say that they're for it. Not all that surprising, I'll admit, but very, very interesting. Oh, Brianna, you're on mute.
Okay, awesome. Well, deploying the National Guard is very recent and very close to home. I remember coming to the gym here downtown, and I mean, I could see the troops was very scary. So, my question to you is this the right thing to do or not?
Well, it's the right question to ask. And our group, as we just saw, Brianna, believes that it's not necessary. And either by taking other types of anti-crime measures or just continue on the path that we're on makes a lot more sense. So to me, I'll take your question and I'll broaden it. Um, do we think that Trump is doing this primarily for political purposes, or does he see this as a way to reduce crime? Um, my own belief is it's both. Um, he certainly does believe, as we should mention, does the mayor of Los Angeles, the mayor of the District of Columbia, that having these troops on the street does have a deterring effect on crime. Arrests are up, particularly in 8th and 9th Ward of Washington, D.C., which are the lowest income and highest poverty areas. So it's clear that there is some impact. But I also understand why our group is so suspicious, because not only does Trump, because not only is Trump appear to be doing this for political purposes, he has as much stated so out loud and talks about what a difficult position it puts Democrats in, because if they oppose him, then the potential exists for voters to think that they are comfortable with higher levels of crime than other people would find acceptable. So I think I go with the second cohort answering the previous question, which was saying I would support something like this. I would support steps like this if they're done as part of a cooperative effort between a president and local and state authorities. Historically, that's the way it's worked in this country. And with that kind of multi-jurisdictional cooperation, I think you may be able to have an additional benefit without creating the political issues. But as we talk about the politics of it, the logical question also then is who does politically benefit from this debate? And Krista, if you can put up that next question, we asked you a minute ago whether you agreed with what Trump are doing is not. Now, here's a question where I'm asking you not to tell us your position, but rather how you think this is playing. Who will benefit politically from this debate? Is Trump benefiting? Even for those of you who disagree with his decision, is this working to his political benefit in terms of building public and political support? Second, to the Democrats in Congress benefit by talking about how they don't think this is the right thing to do. Do Democratic mayors and governors benefit politically from being on the ground as these public safety and political challenges play out? Or alternatively, do both sides benefit equally? But do both sides benefit, or does nobody benefit politically? What do we think? Well, that's a really interesting set of answers. 42% of our group, a little bit less than half, believes that even though a majority of our audience does not agree with what Trump is doing, a plurality here, and a fairly sizable plurality of 42%, believes that he benefits politically. Very few people think that the Democrats in Congress are benefiting. A slightly larger number think the mayors and governors, that the Democratic mayors and governors are benefiting. And then somewhat larger numbers than that, 19 are more equivocal. 19% say both sides benefit from looking like they're paying attention to public safety issues. 23% of you say neither side benefits, presumably because voters do see this as either unnecessary or political or both. But in some ways, and Brianna, I think you'd agree with me on this, in some ways, and I think our audience picked up on this by the low numbers that letters B and C, Democrats in Congress and Democratic mayors and governors got as options. I think most of our group sees the political trap that Trump is laying for the Democrats on this, don't you think?
Yeah. So what's the best option for Democrats to do in response to this issue right now?
Oh, we've seen a few different options. As I mentioned earlier, Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington, D.C., has been very cooperative. Um, Yesterday, talking about agreeing to have the National Guard continue in her city for the foreseeable future. But even before that, while being very careful to defend the autonomy of the District of Columbia, going out of her way to express her appreciation to Trump for trying to make the city safer, because she's aware that many of her constituents do feel like there's too much crime in the district. Governor Newsom, of course, here in California, not surprisingly, is much more combative about it. And he announced today that the cost of deploying the Guard all this time has been more than $120 million, and is demanding the White House reimburse the state of California and the city of Los Angeles for it. In Illinois and Chicago, the governor, J.B. Pritzker, and Mayor Brandon Johnson have also been more confrontational. Pritzker, in particular, saying some very harsh things about Trump, and Mayor Johnson issuing an executive order at the local level, ordering the Chicago Police Department not to cooperate with the National Guard or federal troops should they be deployed here. The way I've seen this handled best is in the state of Maryland. Governor Wes Moore there invited, it was really interesting. He invited he invited President Trump to come to Baltimore and walk the streets of the city with him. Say, the president isn't here nearly as often as I am, as our governor. I've seen how, even though we still have additional challenges, how much progress we've made and how much safer Baltimore is. I'd like to invite the president to join us. Trump, not surprisingly, didn't accept the invitation. And then Moore also did something pretty interesting. As you know, as many of you know, Governor Moore is retired military. And so in pushing back at Trump, he made it clear that he was not against additional measures to improve the safety of the people of Baltimore, but that he, as a military veteran, understood what military troops were trained for and what they were not trained to do. And so by deploying his own biographical credibility to talk about his military experience, I feel like Governor Moore was able to push back against Trump without looking, quote unquote, weak on crime. I think it's one of the many reasons that a lot of Democrats are looking at Wesley Moore as a potential candidate for president in 2028. And I've noticed that Governor Moore is being a little bit less aggressive in knocking down those rumors than he used to be. But what we do want to do, because we're a little bit more than halfway through the first portion of the program, as Richard mentioned, we do want to switch the topic to immigration, because in a lot of ways, these issues are interwoven, both because they address public safety concerns of many voters, not only because both issues have played to Trump's political benefit for that reason, but a lot of Trump's critics believe that the real reason he's deploying Guard troops to these cities is to use them as a way to reach out more aggressively against the undocumented population in these cities and to arrest them and to deport them from the country. But I want to take a step back for a minute, just a little bit of history. We're not going to go back too far, at least not yet. We might a little bit later. But it's worth noting that in 2013, so 12 years ago, Republicans had just lost a presidential election. Mitt Romney had been defeated by Barack Obama. And the Republican National Committee commissioned a post-election analysis, asking several party experts to offer their assessment on what Republicans needed to be doing differently to be more successful than they had been in the 2008 and 2012 elections against Obama. And the primary recommendation from this task force, this Republican National Committee task force, was to call for a more inclusive tone in the way it talked to underrepresented communities and a commitment to comprehensive immigration reform. And the task force said very strongly that the Republican Party needed to become a proponent of immigration reform in order to be able to more aggressively reach out not only to Latino and Asian Pacific voters, but to younger voters as well. So 2013, the Republican National Committee says this is something we need to do. 2 years later, Donald Trump makes his announcement speech in New York City at Trump Tower. And the speech, as many of you remember, was marked by attacks on undocumented Mexican immigrants and used terms like rapists and murderers, and then followed weeks later by calling on a ban on all Muslim immigrants from entering the United States. And so what we saw is a Republican Party that had indicated it was looking to move in a different direction in immigration, learning from Donald Trump and his supporters that the party was not as ready to move on as all that. Look, and large numbers of Americans, primarily Republicans, but a good number of independents and some Democrats as well, responded very favorably to Trump's very combative approach on this issue. And without splitting hairs, let's just say he got roughly half the vote in each of the last 3 elections. So that's a lot of voters who think that this more combative approach on issue like immigration is the right one. But what's less noticed, because Trump's stridency on this issue gets so much attention, what's less noticed and just as important is just as the Republican Party was moving rightward on the issue, the Democratic Party was moving just as aggressively further to the political left. And if you go back to the late 20th century, since the early 1990s, Democrats have moved in very sizable numbers toward more accommodating, less restrictionist positions on border security, workplace and hiring practices, and most legalization matters. And so by the time the 2020 presidential election came along, there was a debate in late 2019 in which the Democratic candidates were all on stage, and they were asked if they supported decriminalizing unauthorized border crossings. And every single Democrat on the stage raised their hand to say that they did believe that crossing the border without documentation should be decriminalized. The one exception to that was the senator from Colorado, Michael Bennett, who drew just a little bit less than 1% in the primary polls. So Trump and the Republicans are moving rightward. Democrats weren't moving leftward to the point of decriminalizing the border, which a lot of centrist voters found unacceptable as well. And so now the key to Trump's support on this issue, most notably last year, what has been that he asserts so frequently that he only targets those immigrants who have committed violent crimes or engaged in other types of serious unlawful behavior apart from their residency status. And so talking about racists, talking about murderers, talking about violent criminals, and not surprisingly, a large majority of American voters believe that removing people who committed those types of violent crimes from the country is a good idea. But over the last 6-7 months, it's become very clear that the Trump administration has also been targeting many, many migrants who have neither been accused nor convicted of any crime other than residency. So I think one of the reasons that we're beginning to see Trump's poll numbers and support drop on immigration-related issues is because Americans are seeing otherwise law-abiding individuals being caught up in ICE raids, being imprisoned, and being deported. And so his numbers on these issues are struggling, which is why I think we're seeing a more aggressive action in LA and DC and elsewhere. Now, there's a counter push on this. Trump's been hearing from political allies who aren't as wild about this more aggressive agenda and this more aggressive approach on undocumented immigrants. And more specifically, he's hearing from political supporters who work in the agricultural community, who run agribusiness concerns, who work in the who run hotel and restaurant interests, and who run construction and manufacturing operations. Because each of these economic sectors, to a large degree, rely on undocumented immigrants to do this work. And they're beginning to panic that they're not going to have a sufficient workforce to get the work done. Trump launched a trial balloon. He suggested publicly several weeks ago that maybe there needed to be some type of accommodation for an undocumented immigrant who'd been in the country for several years working in this way. But his base responded very, very badly on this. And so the end result, and we'll talk more about this in just a bit, has been a very, very notable reduction for the first time in modern history in the number of immigrants, both documented and undocumented. One of the first reductions in a long, long time of the number of immigrants in our country.
So Dan, what do you think this dramatic reduction of immigrant workers and foreign-born individuals mean for the country politically, economically, or even other policy areas?
Well, politically, as we've already indicated, it's a very, very deeply divisive issue. And it's an incredibly emotional issue. And while I would argue it's an issue that helped Trump significantly in 2016, maybe a bit less in 2020, but much, much more in 2024, it's starting to hurt him now, primarily because his administration is now targeting undocumented immigrants who otherwise do not have any type of criminal records. Economically, this could present a real challenge because for voters who are worried about inflation, we know that if there are fewer migrant workers in the fields, the price of groceries will go up. If there are fewer migrants working in the construction industry, we know the cost of housing will go up. If there are fewer migrant workers working at manufacturing plants, we know the cost of products will go up. Add to that an aging population in this country and most other Western nations means that in order to have enough workers to support an aging population, this country is either going to have to dramatically increase its birth rate, which is something we've heard Vice President Vance talking about quite a bit recently, or alternatively, allow more workers to come here to join the workforce. So politically, it presents somewhat of a challenge. It's more of a mixed bag for Trump at this point. Economically, I think it's an even greater challenge. But I want to ask a couple of questions, if we can, Krista, of our group, not so much about Trump, but just more broadly on this question of foreign-born individuals in this country. So there are currently 51.9 million individuals in this country who were born in other countries. That's 15.4% of the US population. Do you think that that number, 15.4% of the population, 51.9 million people, do we think that's too few foreign-born individuals in this country? Do we think it's too many? Or do we think it's just about right? And let's see those answers when we get them. Okay, Krista. 75% say just about right. Only 6% of our group, not all that surprisingly, thinks that that's too high a number. 19% think it's too few and that there should be even more migrants in this country. So let's ask a follow-up question. I mentioned a moment ago how the number a foreign-born individual in this country has dropped since January. So in January, there were 53.3 million foreign-born individuals in this country, compared to 51.9 million today. That's 15.8% of the US population, almost 16%. Do you think that number is too few, too many, or just about right? What do we get, Krista? Interesting, the numbers do shift a little bit. 60% say that those higher numbers were just about right. 35%, a larger response rate, thinks that that's too few, even though it's a larger number than we have today. And 6% say too many. So maybe next time we'll have to do this with the numbers side by side to see if we can figure it out. But either way, so we're talking about a current US population of which a little bit more than 15% of the population were born in other countries. So what we know from research, both throughout US history, but also in countries all over the world, we know that whenever the rate of the percentage of foreign-born population in a population goes over 12%, we know that there will almost inevitably be a political backlash against migration at that point. And given that these numbers have been at such a high, whether you happen to agree with the public sentiment or not, it shouldn't be surprising to us that there has been such a strong political movement that has worked to Trump's benefit to advocate for more restrictionist approaches on undocumented immigration. And I should stress that this is nothing new in this country. This has been the case here in the US since the end of the Revolutionary War in the 1790s. After the US became a country, the number of French and Irish immigrants started to flow into the United States. And of course, that's when Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Act. In the 19th century, there was an immense backlash against Catholics in the years just before the Civil War, leading to another crackdown. Go to the early 20th century and think about the Chinese Exclusion Act, other Gilded Age restrictions to limit that led to limitations of migrants and deportations during the Great Depression. So for 250 years in this country, when the level of foreign-born in our population reaches a certain level, the country pushes back. And we're seeing exactly the same thing to an even greater degree in Great Britain right now. We're seeing it throughout Europe. And interestingly enough, a country that's never really had much in the way of foreign migration, we're even beginning to see this backlash in Japan, most notably. So it seems to me the question going forward, in addition to when do you choose to admit new arrivals into your country and when don't you, is recognizing that if those numbers rise above a certain level, how do you address it politically to avoid that kind of backlash? And that's a much more complicated conversation. So plenty of other things for us to talk about immigration, but because we spent a good amount of time talking about Trump and the National Guard, this is probably an issue we will almost certainly come back to in the future. What I'd like to do instead, Brianna, if you're up for it, because we're a little bit past the bottom of the hour, is maybe we can move on to our audience questions and see how many of those we can answer. What do you think?
Yeah, we got some pretty good questions here in the chat. Thank you for everyone and if you haven't yet, go ahead and put your questions down. We'll try to get to all of them. The first question here says, recently a federal judge stated that Trump's federalizing the National Guard in Los Angeles was an illegal act. He also lost 93% of his court cases. How do you think the Supreme Court will rule on these lost cases?
Okay. So we should be clear that a federal judge has ruled that it was an illegal act. We won't know that for certainty until the debate moves through the court system. Um, I'm not that good at predicting the outcome of elections, and I'm even worse at predicting the US Supreme Court. But I suspect that the court will be willing to consider restrictions on a president's ability to deploy guard troops. Again, just my guess, and I am not a legal or a constitutional expert, is that they will carve out an exception for emergencies and national crises, which is what Trump cited in this regard. But I suspect that they will carve out those exceptions for emergencies more precisely than is currently the case. The way it works now is if a president says this is a national emergency, well, then it is. And if there are more specific parameters than I could imposed by the court, then while it's not impossible, it becomes a greater challenge. On the other hand, this court tends to be deferential to some degree to Congress and remind Congress on many occasions that it's not the court's job to legislate. It's the court's job to interpret the law. And if Congress thinks there ought to be a law setting up more narrow parameters for the president, then Congress should pass that law rather than relying on the courts to act for them. So will they enact stricter parameters? I think that's likely. But I could also see them finding a way to dump this just back into Congress's lap too.
Okay, and this one is fresh news, happened today. Today, President Trump announced that he would rename the Department of Defense as the Department of War. Could this be interpreted as a signal of how he might envision using U.S. armed forces, both domestically and abroad, in regions such as Greenland?
So some of Trump's allies like to use the phrase flooding the zone. And what they mean by that is that because Trump makes news, and in particular makes news so aggravating to his opponents on so many different fronts at one time, that there isn't enough time or attention to respond to all of those. And so I don't think that there is going to be a significant substantive difference between the Department of Defense and the Department of War. But I think he does see it as a convenient way of angering his opponents and taking up that much more bandwidth to detract from other fights that he would just as soon not see getting as much attention. It's worth remembering, of course, that the department was originally known as the Department of War, and the name was switched to the Department of Defense in the post-World War II era. And I think many would argue and many would agree that sends a better message about the true purposes for our military. But I think this is goading his opponents on a political basis more than any substantive change in the way the department does its work.
Now, this one is more statistics based. They ask how much of the rhetoric about criminals coming over the border is propaganda that does not support actual evidence.
Okay, so the numbers of individuals who come into this country without documentation, while there's no way to keep track of that data precisely, over history under both Democratic and Republican administrations, the estimates have been pretty precise. And it's commonly agreed, not only by Republicans but by Democrats, that the number of undocumented immigrants into this country rose fairly dramatically during the years of the Biden administration, and that the numbers have dropped in a very rare way over the last 6 months. So I wouldn't be confident in the specific digits, but I think on overall trends and broader estimates, I think we can be fairly confident that these numbers do reflect the actual situation on the ground.
Okay. Here's another one. Do you think that if Trump made it clear that only criminals that were to be targeted of ICE instead of, only that if he made it clear that only criminals were to be targeted of ICE instead of profiling based on language and skin color, that even more of the country would have been supportive of him? And
Yeah. I'll go
yeah,
ahead. I'm sorry.
why not deport convicted felons who were in prison who are illegal immigrants?
Okay, so two really good questions there. On the first one, I don't believe there's any question at all that if the Trump administration were more specific in its apprehension and deportation efforts toward those who committed violent or serious crimes, not just something relating to the residency or their crossing the border, I think Trump would be enjoying much, much broader support on this front than he currently does. And as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the reasons that his poll numbers and his level of support has dropped on immigration related issues is because of the increasing evidence that his administration is targeting those without uh, criminal charges or convictions on their records. So I think a more specific targeting would do him a world of good politically. Why doesn't his administration do that is the logical follow-up question, and it's also the smart one to ask. Well, I think Trump understands either intentionally or intuitively, and the people around him understand that voters do believe, even if they don't want to say it out loud, that if more than 15% of the population is foreign born, that is, in their opinion, too much. And this gets to the points I was making earlier about political backlash. When the 1790s or the 1850s or the Gilded Age or the Great Depression, or more recently, when the immigration figures go up to a great degree, voters respond very strongly in the other direction. So Trump and his advisors are very, very focused on reducing those numbers as quickly as possible. And as we talked about earlier, they've been successful in that regard. And it's my belief that if they were to limit their efforts only to those with violent criminal records, they wouldn't be reducing the numbers nearly as much. And they seem to have decided to make the calculated risk that they would rather more dramatically reduce the overall number of immigrants into this country, even if it means sweeping up a number of those who have not been involved in criminal activity. Whether that's the right or the wrong thing from a substantive basis is for each one of us to decide individually. I certainly have very strong opinions on that. But I would say that politically, that may represent a miscalculation on their part.
Thank you. Another audience member asks, you mentioned the dependence of certain industries on immigrants. This has been true for decades. How would you explain the refusal of political parties to dispassionately address this issue?
Well, for many, many years, the Democrats were the party of the working class. And one of the reasons the Democrats tended to fight immigration reform is because organized labor saw large numbers of new arrivals as a uh, challenge, as competition for their members. Now, as the nature of the union workforce changed and Democrats became more supportive of immigration reform, at the same time, the Republicans were becoming more and more reliant on working class voters, voters who had not graduated from college. So now it's many of their constituents who worry that they might lose jobs if larger numbers of people came here from other countries. So there is, over the years in both parties, previously in the Democratic Party, now more in the Republican Party, a worry about the need to protect American jobs. But I think at least right now, Brianna, it's part of a broader tendency that we've talked about in this webinar before. We are going through one of our periodic experiences with isolationism in this country. And that's been the case for more than a century now. After every war, after every major economic downturn, our country tends to look inward. And so looking for ways not to deal with the rest of the world, diplomatically, militarily, or economically, a lot of Americans just want to put up walls for right now. And I think that's having an impact in the immigration debate the same way it is on trade policy and on other matters of international affairs. Um, there will come a point where it becomes apparent how much an aging population like ours requires an influx of new workers. And I think what that shock therapy will be, as I was indicating earlier, will be higher prices for groceries, for housing, for manufactured goods. At that point, the people who run those types of enterprises will say, we need more workers. And I suspect at that point, more and more Americans will come to the conclusion that the questioner did.
Okay, this is another really good question. What differences emerge in societal reactions to immigration between countries that actively integrate and assimilate immigrant populations and those that segregate them?
Can you ask the question again? I just want to make sure I caught it.
Mhm. What's the difference in societal reactions to immigration between countries that actively integrate and assimilate immigrant populations
Oh,
and those who segregate them?
all right. So it's a really, really smart question.
Yeah.
I talked earlier about how the overall levels of migration could often lead to political backlash. Well, what leads to that backlash to an even greater degree is when those new arrivals do not integrate into the broader community. So when individuals, when families, when communities move here and interact personally, culturally, society, economically with the rest of a community, then the backlash is much less because the familiarity has developed. But when those new arrivals tend to settle in more segregated areas, either by choice or by edict, the backlash becomes more pronounced because there isn't the opportunity for that kind of cross interaction. It's a really, really smart point, and I'm glad it came up because it gave me a chance to add to the point we were discussing earlier about the overall numbers, because it is more complicated than that.
You listed crime reduction and immigration enforcement as possible reasons from federal troop deployment. What about increasing authoritarianism?
What about increasing authoritarianism? It's a really good question also. Um, I feel like a phrase like a term like authoritarianism is sort of a litmus test. If you are a supporter of the individual assuming more authority, then you think it's simply a strong leader. If you're a political foe of that individual, then you see it as authoritarianism. There's no question that Trump himself believes that the president should have more authority than has historically been the case, and that Congress, the courts, the business community, the media should not have as much ability to restrain a president as has been the case for much of our nation's past. But I would say that if you support him for other reasons, then that's a strong leader taking control. If you oppose him for other reasons, then it's authoritarianism. Now, Trump himself, let's go back to the point we were discussing earlier about his use of the language of Department of War, in my opinion, to sort of goad his opponents. The other day he was talking about crime, and Trump mused aloud that many residents of these larger cities would welcome a dictator if that dictator could make crime stop or decrease to a great degree. And of course, what he knew going in is using a term dictator like that in a theoretically positive way would so sufficiently anger his opponents that there'd be more of an argument about that than some of the policy debates that he would prefer to avoid getting a lot of attention. But it's not surprising, therefore, that those who oppose Trump on the substance and on policy see him asserting more power in just that light.
Thank you. Another question. Since there is a recognized shortage of workers in several key industries, why not simply increase the annual number of H-1 and H-2 visas?
All right, so I actually in H-1 and H-2 visas, for those of you who don't specialize in this field, are visas for very specific types of skilled workers. So a farm worker or a factory worker comes here under one set of rules, but if you have, for example, technology-based expertise, if you're an engineer, you can come here under an H-1B visa, and the rules tend to be somewhat more welcoming. Well, there are many American interests who believe that US companies over rely on these visas to bring in workers and pay them lower salaries than an equally qualified person here in the US would make if they were to qualify for one of those jobs, if there weren't as many of these visas available. The companies and the visa recipients themselves say just the opposite. There aren't enough Americans with these advanced skills. So companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere do need these visas in order to bring skilled workers over. In the interest of full disclosure, I worked on the H-1B visa issue many years ago with a number of Silicon Valley interests to increase the number of visas available to foreign technology trained workers. So I think for the most part, these are workers who are coming to fill jobs that not a sufficient number of American college graduates are yet qualified to fill. But there's no question there are abuses of the system. And if you run a high-tech company in Silicon Valley or elsewhere and know that you can hire a bunch of engineers for much less money to come here from another country than those who graduate from a US university, there is potential for significant abuse there. So I think the answer is not to get rid of these visas, but rather to impose a greater level of oversight to make sure that they're only granted when a US college graduate or skilled worker is not available for the job.
All right. Thank you so much. Here's another one. This was a little bit more recent. How is it legal for Trump's administration to kill 11 people on a boat without showing any proof that they were drug traffickers? Why isn't this considered a crime?
Okay, so I think most of you have read the news about the confrontation off the coast of Venezuela earlier this week. And what the Trump administration has done is, unlike in the past, when drug traffickers were arrested and treated like criminals, uh, Trump ordered his, Trump orders his administration to teach them not teach them not like criminals, but like terrorists. And his argument was they are bringing illegal drugs into our country, and therefore they should be treated as if they were part of an invading force. I suspect, like so many of the things we've talked about today, ultimately this is something that will be decided by the courts. And if the courts decide that an individual or a group of people who bring large amounts of illegal drugs into this country are constituting a broader threat than a more common criminal, then I suspect that this type of reaction will be judged to be constitutional. At least in the first couple days, we've heard a few different responses from Trump and from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. I think we'll need to wait a few more days for them to get their story straight so they can defend what they did. And at that point, judge whether their stated explanation is up to snuff or not. But whether you happen to agree with it or not, it's a really important step that Trump has ordered his administration to take. He's saying these are not criminals to arrest. This is a foreign military presence to eliminate. And that is something that we haven't seen before. And ultimately we'll find out from the courts, and I think from Congress as well, whether that's the kind of stuff that they're comfortable with or not. Richard, welcome back.
You know, Dan, I'm not seeing anybody here for whatever reason. I thought like I just lost my picture here for some reason. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for a terrific discussion. By the way, that explanation of the last one you gave about what's going on in Venezuela is very important. The difference that Trump has made by the declaration of groups like Tren de Aragua, the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel the Sinaloa, all those changing the whole entire equation from criminality to national security is really an important question. But you've raised so many fascinating insights and points. I want to thank you very much as always. And I want to thank Brianna for being our moderator for today. First time, great job, Brianna.
Excellent job.
Yes, and want to thank Krista for also helping with the poll questions and doing all the background there. And I want to thank all of our audience members who were today. Great questions, really insightful as always. But it's such a pleasure to have Dan answer those questions. And if you didn't get your question answered, I remind those who are members, there's a members only session following this. So again, as always, though, Dan, thank you so much. This has been a really great discussion. I enjoyed it. I know all of our members did as well. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks everybody as always for being with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Have a great day now.